Nutrition for Food Service and Culinary Professionals. Today we're talking about Chapter 5, which is protein. Most people recognize that protein foods are an important component of a nutritious diet. There's no doubt about that. The word protein actually comes from the Greek word proteus, meaning of prime importance. Protein is essential for life because it's needed to build and maintain the body. All living cells and most body fluids contain protein. But the question that most people ask when I see them is, am I getting enough? And I always reassure them that 9 times out of 10, people are getting enough protein. Most Americans actually eat more protein than the body requires, and many times, along with it, excessive saturated fat and cholesterol that comes with the protein choices. Today, we are likely to see more plant proteins such as beans and whole grains than ever before. So I think you'll be very surprised to find where protein comes from, and that even if you are following a vegetarian or vegan diet, it's very, very easy to get the protein sources in. But no matter what, it still takes proper menu or meal planning. So what are our learning objectives for today? We're going to review and compare and contrast the nutrients in animal and plant sources of protein, including examples of complementary protein, and we'll talk about just what that is. We're going to explain how proteins are digested, absorbed, and used in the body, and we'll list types and health benefits of vegetarian diets and how especially important it is for meal planning to do if you're following a vegetarian meal or if you're cooking for a vegetarian. We're going to talk about the dietary recommendations for protein and some of the consequences of eating too much or too little. So let's move on. So just what is protein? Proteins are nutrients found in all living cells in animals and plants. Protein is a major part of the body's cells. You have protein in your skin, your hair, your nails, muscles, and blood, just to name a few. As a macronutrient, like we talked about proteins and carbohydrates and fats, protein is a macronutrient, but its most important function is to build and maintain the body. And it's important to remember that because remember when we were talking about carbohydrates, which was your body's most important energy source, and fat was a concentrated energy source, so you don't need a lot of it. Well, protein's major function is building and maintaining your body. Worn out cells are constantly replaced in the body, so protein is required every day. Unlike carbohydrates and fats, they are used as a primary energy source. So there's a big difference in why we need the different macronutrients and what their function is in the body. Proteins in blood act as taxi cabs or Uber drivers. They help to transport iron and fat and minerals and oxygen throughout the body. Antibodies, enzymes, and hormones are composed of protein. Antibodies are large proteins that are found in the blood that detect and destroy invaders, such as bacteria and disease. For example, the invader may be a flu virus. Each antibody fights a specific invader. An antibody that binds with a certain cold virus is of no use to you if you have a different strain of the virus. But exposure to a cold virus results in increased amounts of the specific type of antibody that can attack it. Next time that particular cold virus comes around, your body remembers and it makes the right antibodies. This time the virus is destroyed faster and your body's response, called the immune response, is sufficient to combat the disease. Without enough protein, your body cannot make all the antibodies it needs. So again, protein is a nutrient in all living cells that is very, very important to build and maintain the body. Enzymes are specialized protein substances that are called catalysts that help to regulate the speed of chemical reactions within cells. Enzymes assist in breaking food down during digestion. They help build substances such as bone and help to change one substance to another as needed by the body. Although enzymes regulate many reactions, they are not changes in the process. Although enzymes regulate many reactions, they are not changed in the process. Cells of plants contain enzymes that cause them to grow and ripen. Hormones, on the other hand, are actually chemical messengers. They're chemical messenger proteins that regulate body functions to maintain normal levels of essential substances. For example, the hormone insulin regulates blood sugar levels by moving sugar from the blood into and out of cells. Other hormones regulate growth, reproduction, and behavior. Protein is necessary for blood to clot normally and to maintain the body's acid-base balance. Like fat and carbs, protein is an energy nutrient. It provides 4 calories a gram, and when the diet lacks sufficient calories from carbs and fat, protein that is circulating in the bloodstream will be used for fuel. If more calories are needed, protein will be taken from muscles and other tissues, which is why people who are dieting may lose lean tissue as well as body fat. Loss of muscle mass also can occur with prolonged physical activity, high fever, severe burns, or in diseases that alter metabolism. Okay, what about the protein in food? Proteins are long chains of amino acids. Amino acids are actually the building blocks of protein and are linked together in protein strands connected by peptide bonds. Proteins are large, complex chemical structures containing many amino acids, each composed of carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Some amino acids also contain sulfur and phosphorus. There are 20 distinct amino acids, and they're divided into 2 categories, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. There are essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. The essential amino acids must be provided by food because they either can't be made in the body or can't be made in quantities that are needed, so you have to get them from food. Essential amino acids become important when discussing vegetarian diets, which will be covered later in the chapter. Non-essential amino acids are actually made in the body. Consumption of amino acids as supplements is not required when a variety of foods and adequate calories are included in the diet. So as we mention in just about every chapter of the book, it's so important to consider eating food, eating a wide variety of food, and having good balance in your diet so that you don't have to really rely on any supplementation. But when it comes to amino acids, most people are getting the protein that they need. So you're automatically getting those amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. So protein is found not only in animal foods, but also plant foods. And the amount of protein in each different food varies. So for instance, when you eat animal foods such as beef, poultry, dairy products, they have more protein per ounce than plant foods. So in about a 3-ounce portion of meat, poultry, fish, there's about 20 grams of protein. And there's 8 grams of protein in 1 cup of milk. When we eat plant foods, such as legumes and nuts, they're also very good sources of protein, but they generally have about 6 to 8 grams per serving. And then when you have things like grains, which are cereals, breads, anything in the grain group, and also vegetables, they both have some protein, and they're about 3 to 4 grams of protein per serving. Fruit, on the other hand, has no protein at all. So I want to reiterate this point for a minute. When we eat food, every food is a combination of different macronutrients. So as this slide portrays, when you eat animal food like beef and poultry, dairy products, seafood, we're getting, protein and a little bit of fat. If it's a high-fat beef like a marbled ribeye, or if you're eating the fat on your steak, or if you're eating the chicken on your skin, you're getting, considerable amount of fat along with the protein. There's no carbohydrate in animal products. Now, on the other hand, when you're eating plant foods or legumes or nuts, plant foods such as, any kind of protein, plant protein, you're getting a little bit of protein. You're getting 6 to 8 grams per serving, but generally you don't get any fat at all unless the food is cooked with fat. Nuts, on the other hand, are high in fat. So I know this sounds a little confusing, but what I want you to remember is even though we talk about certain foods being high in protein, they still may have the macronutrients, fat and carbohydrate in them. When it comes to fruit, there's no protein at all. It's primarily carbohydrate. And here's some examples of protein-rich foods, which there's a lot. And when I look at this picture, I can realize that they're not all equivalent in the amount of protein. For instance, on the left-hand side, we have our seafood and our beef. We have milk. We have some poultry there. Those are going to have considerably more protein than some of the food in the right side of the page, such as your fruits and vegetables. The foods on the left-hand side of the page are going to have considerable amount of protein compared to the foods on the right, such as your vegetables, which are really going to have very little protein in comparison. Now, this is one page that I really want you to remember, not only for the sake of possible quiz, but also for meal planning, because when you are planning a meal, you have to know what the equivalent protein sources are. So when I'm eating an ounce of meat or an ounce of chicken or turkey or fish, that's the same exact number of protein grams as 1 egg, 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, half a cup of cooked beans or peas, 1/4 cup of tofu, 1 ounce of tempeh, 1 ounce of nuts or seeds. This is so helpful to know what you can substitute in. So for instance, if I'm eliminating the animal protein from the meal, then I know that I could have a very good quality protein in its place, and it can be a plant food. It can be an egg. It can be peanut butter. But what I want you to realize is the calorie content may be a little different. So an ounce of fish is quite a bit different than 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. And then also you have to realize that most people aren't eating an ounce, that you're generally serving 3, 4, 5, 6 ounces in a serving. We would highly recommend 3 to 4 ounce maximum per meal. As you know, probably from working in the industry, that lunch servings are usually 6 ounces, 6 to 8 ounces. And if you're eating out or dining out at dinner, it could be anywhere from 8 to 12 ounce portion of protein. But for the purposes of meal planning, it's really important to remember that there are equivalents. So that if you don't want to add, let's say, chicken to a salad, you can certainly add nuts instead and realize that you are providing the protein. And that brings us to the amount of fat in protein foods. So when I look at the bottom of the chain, the plant foods, they have very little to no saturated fat. And remember, we talked about saturated fat in the last chapter. Saturated fats are the ones that you want lower in your diet because they tend to put you at higher cardiovascular risk. So most plant foods have very little to no saturated fat. When you're eating nuts and seeds, they contain fat, but they're mostly good fat, like polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. Fish and shellfish also contain small amounts of fat. Nothing appreciable, except if you're cooking them with a lot of fat, then obviously you're adding fat. Even fatty fish, such as salmon, are really close in nutrient content to chicken breasts without skin in terms of the fat and the saturated fat content. And much of the fat that's in seafood is actually good for you. Remember, we talked about the omega-3 fatty acids. Those are a form of polyunsaturated fats. So even if it's a fatty fish, it's still really good for you in terms of the quality of fat. So when you're looking at, planning meals, many protein-rich animal foods come with a lot more saturated fat than plant foods. And I want you to refer to Table 5-1 on page 127 in your textbook for a list of servings of various protein foods, and it'll give you the amount of the calories, protein, fat, saturated fat, and fiber. So I know it gets really confusing in the beginning of the semester when you're just learning, but when you're eating these different foods, there's a lot of different properties. So when I'm choosing plant foods for my protein, obviously there's little to no saturated fat, plus you're getting the benefit of the added fiber. When I eat animal products, if they're lean, I'm getting the same quality protein, very little fat. I'm not getting any fiber. So there's benefits in eating a lot of different food, and that's why it's so important to get variety. When we talk about those protein foods that have fat, foods such as ground beef, whole milk, cheddar cheese may be really high in saturated fat than some of the plant foods. And we talked about nuts and seeds before containing fat, but they're really the healthy kind of fat. So again, it sounds a little confusing, but the important thing to remember is you want a good variety of all food in your diet and really don't want to eliminate any specific foods, because the more variety you get, the more variety of nutrients, a variety of types of fat, the addition of more fiber, etc. When in doubt, always go back to the visual, which is the My Plate. And that visual will give you an idea of if you're going in the right direction when you're planning a meal. 1/4 of my plate should have protein. 3/4 of my plate should be carbohydrates in the form of grains, vegetables, and fruits. Okay, so what about complementary proteins? This term kind of trips some of the students up, but complementary proteins are whether they have an adequate amount of amino acids or not. So when I talk about a complete protein, I'm referring to animal proteins because they contain all the essential amino acids that are in the right proportions needed by the body. Complete proteins are foods that provide all the essential amino acids, and they're in sufficient amounts to support growth and maintenance of body tissues. Therefore, they have what is called high biological value. The biological value of protein refers to the amount, the type, and the proportion of amino acids that are present in a food to meet bodily needs. The egg is used as a standard by which all other protein quality values are based. The egg has a very good score, a biological value of 100. All of the essential amino acids are present in perfect amounts. Foods that contain complete proteins include things like meat, fish, poultry, cheese, eggs, milk, and isolated soy protein. This means they contain complete proteins. On the other hand, we have incomplete proteins. Incomplete proteins basically lack one or more of the essential amino acids in sufficient quantities to support growth and maintenance of body tissue. So some of the examples of incomplete proteins or plant proteins would be dried beans, peas, grains, nuts, seeds, and possibly vegetables. While most people choose to include some animal protein in their diet, it's important to realize that all of the essential amino acids can be obtained by consuming a variety of plant foods, each with different types and quantities of amino acids. So again, if you're eating a wide variety of food, you can include all of that to get your protein. But let's say you are going more towards a vegetarian or a plant-based diet. Your meal planning and planning for your meals has to be so much you have to be so much more diligent doing that so that you get the adequate nutrition. So that's where we come into the planning of what we call complementary proteins. Making incomplete proteins complete is as simple as eating a peanut butter sandwich, or beans and cornbread, or a bean burrito. Complementary protein is the ability of two protein foods to make up for the lack of certain amino acids in each other, and that's when eaten over a course of a day. So you don't necessarily have to eat two different protein foods at the same meal, but generally we do. And that's why I give you the example of the peanut butter sandwich. Bread is an incomplete protein, and so is peanut butter, but when you eat them together, they complement one another, and that's where the word complementary comes in. When you eat beans by themselves, they're lacking all the amino acids that you need, or some of the amino acids. When you combine pinto beans with cornbread, all of a sudden you have such a wide variety, you're complementing those amino acids. So, for example, the bread is rich in amino acid methionine, but it's low in lysine. Legumes, which are peanuts and beans, are rich in lysine, but poor in methionine. When both foods are eaten, they complement each other, together providing the amino acid to form the new complete protein. A small amount of complete protein with a larger amount of incomplete protein will make all the protein complete. For example, mac and cheese. The cheese completes the amino acid missing in the macaroni in that mixture. We used to think that foods with complementary proteins had to be eaten at the same meal. It now appears that all necessary amino acids need to be available in the bloodstream or to cells daily, but that eating them at the same meal is not necessarily the case. So this is a concept to really understand when you're planning more plant-based meals, or if you're personally wanting to go that route. It's extremely important to understand, what you're getting into so that you can plan proper nutrition. So let's expand that a little more when we call it complementary protein or protein pairings. It's been common for centuries to combine foods to make complete proteins. Think about the Mexican diet, beans and rice, or the Asian diet, tofu and rice, or maybe an Italian diet, pasta and beans, or American Indian, corn and lima beans. And then, of course, we have, something like hummus, in some sort of bread for the Middle Eastern diet. It's interesting to theorize whether this natural combining of food to make complete proteins was by accident, belief, or maybe a factor of cultural survival. So let's look at proteins in our body. Because proteins are very large, they must be broken down into smaller units. There's nothing new about that. It's just like carbohydrates have to be broken down into smaller units for your body to be able to utilize the food to make energy. The process of digestion of protein breaks dietary protein into separate amino acids, which then circulate through the bloodstream and are available to form proteins that your body needs. The body doesn't store amino acids the way it stores fat. So people must eat protein daily or the body will break down muscle to get the protein it needs. The digestion and metabolism of dietary protein is the ultimate recycling project. Creating the approximately 50,000 different proteins in the body to function properly. The instructions to make proteins are in the core or nucleus of each cell. In the nucleus are molecules called DNA, which contain your genetic makeup. So, protein is in our body and it's necessary, and we have to eat it to be able to provide our body with adequate protein. Protein digestion begins in the stomach. Remember when we talked about carbohydrates, it starts breaking down in your mouth with your saliva. When it comes to protein, it begins in the stomach where the stomach acid actually uncoils the protein enough to allow the enzymes to enter them to do their work. An enzyme in the stomach starts splitting apart amino acids in the proteins. The next stop would be the small intestine, and that's where protein digestion is actually complete. Enzymes break down proteins into almost all single amino acids that are now ready to be absorbed into the small intestine. If the intestinal cells do not use the amino acids, then they travel in the blood to the cells. Amino acids enter the amino acid pool from the diet and the breakdown of body proteins. Amino acids in the pool are then used to make new body proteins, or they may be used to provide energy or some other function if necessary. So what are the functions of protein? As we mentioned earlier, the functions of protein are that they act as a structural component of the body. They build and maintain the body. They're found in many enzymes and hormones and all antibodies. They help transport iron, fats, minerals, and oxygen. They maintain the fluid and acid-base balance. And they provide energy as the last resort. They also helps blood to clot. So it's important to remember that every nutrient that you're eating, carbohydrate, fats, proteins, they all have their own function. And that's why it's important when you're planning a meal to use the visual called the My Plate so that you understand how much of these different food groups that a person needs in their daily diet. So when it comes to protein, for the average healthy person, they only need 3 to 4 ounces per meal. And that's 1/4 of the My Plate visual. So again, this is speaking for healthy individuals. Now, if you are working in a hospital or some sort of institution where they're dealing with medical nutrition therapy, there may be changes in the amount of protein people need. For instance, if you're dealing with a client or patients who have kidney failure, and maybe they haven't got any treatment yet, such as dialysis, if they ate too much protein, they might have a problem because their kidneys can't excrete the end products of protein metabolism. So they might get into trouble if they eat excessive amounts of protein. So they would be very limited on the amount of protein per day. So there's a lot of different diseases and situations, chronic problems, where people have to alter the various macronutrients. But for the general population, we need it, but we don't need as much as people tend to think we do. So what about vegetarian eating? The number of vegetarians in the U.S. has really been on the rise, and we can see that because, even in the Dallas area, there are a lot more restaurants that cater to people who eat plant-based diets. Instead of having animal protein at the center of their plate, vegetarians dine on dishes that emphasize legumes, which are dried beans and peas, whole grains, and vegetables. So there's actually 2 different kinds of vegetarian eating. There's actually a lot more than 2. But there's lacto-ovo, there's lacto-vegetarians, and there's also vegans. Lacto-ovo, meaning lacto meaning milk and milk products, ovo meaning egg. So lacto-ovo vegetarians consume animal products in the form of eggs and milk products. Lacto-vegetarians consume milk and milk products, but not eggs. Vegans, on the other hand, eliminate all the different protein sources except for plant-based products. There's also like pescatarians, which don't eat meat but actually eat some seafood. And why is it important to become vegetarian? And why do people choose to become vegetarian? Because of possibly the health benefits, which is a big one, obviously. Sustainability, for ecological reasons. Vegetarians choose plant protein because livestock and poultry require much land, energy, water, and plant foods, such as soybeans, which might be wasteful. A diet generally higher in plant-based foods is associated with less environmental impact than is the current U.S. diet. So someone might choose to become vegetarian just for the economics. Vegetarian diet might be less expensive because when you look at the grocery bill, generally the meat, poultry, seafood are going to be the more expensive foods that you purchase at the store. Another reason why people become vegetarian is ethics. Vegetarians don't eat meat for ethical reasons. They believe that animals should not suffer or be killed unnecessarily. And then, of course, religious beliefs such as Seventh-day Adventists who practice vegetarianism as a part of their religion. So there's a lot of reasons why people choose. Health benefits are a big concern because when you eat more plant-based foods as opposed to animal products, you can really keep your risk of chronic disease a lot lower. So that brings us to the point, can vegetarian diets be nutritionally adequate? Yes, absolutely. When they're appropriately planned, varied, and adequate in calories. And that's really the important part to remember. If you don't plan meals and just try to wing it, it's very, very difficult to get all the nutrients that you need. And therefore, you must eat a variety of food. When you're eliminating animal protein that may have saturated fat, you're eliminating heavier calories, so it's important to plan the meal so that a person is getting adequate calories. Most vegetarian diets have enough protein, and their diets are very low in saturated fat.